Part 1. The storm rolls in. The wind howled like a wild animal as thick, heavy snowflakes swirled through the air. It was one of those nights where you could feel winter breathing down your neck, icy and unforgiving. Pinecrest, a small town, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, wasn't used to storms like this. People had been warned to stay indoors, but not everyone listened. Clara Thompson stood by the window of her cozy little bakery, watching the world outside turn white. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the chill that seemed to creep in no matter how high she turned up the heat. At 42 years old, Clara had seen plenty of winters in Pinecrest, but something about tonight felt different, more intense, more alive. Her bakery was usually a cheerful place, filled with the smell of fresh bread and sweet pies, but tonight it felt eerily quiet. Only a few customers had come in earlier, hurrying out before the roads got too dangerous. Now the only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. Clara glanced at the time, almost 7 p.m. It was late for her to still be open, especially on a night like this. Most days she would have closed hours ago, gone home to her tiny apartment upstairs and settled into her favorite chair with a cup of tea and a good book. But tonight something kept her lingering. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just instinct, the kind of gut feeling you can't quite explain. As she turned away from the window, ready to lock up for the night, a flash of light caught her eye. Headlights. They flickered weakly through the blizzard, moving erratically along the road outside. Clara frowned. Whoever was driving clearly wasn't handling the conditions well. The car skidded sideways, fishtailing dangerously before disappearing from view. For a moment she hesitated. The logical part of her brain screamed to stay put. It was freezing out there, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. But then another thought pushed its way forward. What if someone needed help? What if whoever was in that car didn't make it out? Clara grabbed her coat from the hook near the door and pulled it tightly around her. Her boots crunched against the snow as she stepped outside, the cold biting at her cheeks and fingers almost instantly. She squinted into the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. Then she saw it. A car, half buried in a snowbank, its front end smashed against a tree. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind. No answer. She moved closer, her breath coming in short bursts as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Through the cracked windshield, she could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. Without thinking twice, Clara yanked open the driver's side door. A man, middle-aged, pale and unconscious, was slumped awkwardly across the seat. His suit jacket was soaked and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. For a second, panic gripped her. What if he was already gone? What if she couldn't do anything? But then she noticed the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. Barely. Clara didn't have time to think about what might happen next. She reached in, grabbed him under the arms, and started pulling. He was heavier than she expected, and the snow made every step a struggle. But she refused to give up. One foot in front of the other, she dragged him toward her bakery, the warmth of the building calling to her like a lifeline. By the time they reached the doorway, Clara's muscles burned, and her lungs felt raw from the freezing air. She hauled him inside and laid him gently on the floor, brushing strands of hair out of her face. Her hands trembled as she checked his pulse again. Still there. Weak, but steady. She worked quickly, removing his wet coat and shoes, wrapping him in blankets from the storage closet. The heat from the radiator began to thaw the icicles forming on his eyelashes. As she knelt beside him, watching his chest rise and fall, a strange sense of calm washed over her. She didn't know who he was or why he'd been driving in such terrible weather, but none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was keeping him alive. And so, as the storm raged on outside, Clara stayed by his side, waiting for him to wake up. Little did she know, this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. The man stirred for the first time just as the clock struck midnight. Clara had been sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him, sipping lukewarm tea to keep herself awake. She'd spent hours watching over him, occasionally adjusting the blankets or dabbing at his forehead with a damp cloth. The cut above his eyebrow wasn't deep, but it had bled enough to leave a rusty stain on the towel she'd pressed against it earlier. When his eyelids fluttered open, Clara leaned forward cautiously. "Hey," she said softly, her voice calm, but firm. "You're safe. Just take it slow." He blinked several times, confusion clouding his face as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. His gaze darted around the room, the warm glow of the bakery lights, the scent of cinnamon and butter lingering in the air, and finally Clara, who sat patiently waiting for him to come back to reality. "Where?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "You're in my bakery," Clara replied, offering him a small smile. "You crashed your car outside. I pulled you out before you froze to death." His brow furrowed as fragments of memory returned. A blinding snowstorm, tires slipping on ice, the sickening crunch of metal hitting wood. He groaned, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. I don't even remember driving here." "What happened?" Clara shrugged lightly, trying to mask her concern. "Looks like you lost control of your car. Lucky for you, I was still up when it happened. Any later, and things might have turned out differently." The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then finally settling on gratitude. "You saved me," he murmured, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "Thank you." Clara waved off his thanks with a dismissive gesture. "Don't mention it. Anyone would have done the same." But he shook his head, clearly unconvinced. Not everyone would risk going out in that storm. Not everyone would care enough to stop. He paused, struggling to sit up despite the protests of his battered body. Clara moved to help him, propping pillows behind his back so he could lean against the wall comfortably. "I'm Daniel," he said after a moment, extending a shaky hand toward her. "Clara," she replied, taking his hand briefly before pulling away to tend to the kettle whistling softly on the stove. She poured 2 mugs of hot tea, one for him, one for herself, and handed him the steaming cup. "Drink this, it'll warm you up." Daniel accepted the mug gratefully, cradling it between his hands as though drawing strength from its heat. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional pop of the radiator and the distant hum of the storm raging outside. Finally, Daniel broke the quiet. "So what's a baker doing awake at midnight during a snowstorm?" he asked, attempting a weak smile. Clara chuckled softly. "Probably the same thing a traveling salesman is doing driving around these roads. At night. Bad timing, mostly. You're not from around here, are you?" "No," Daniel admitted. "I work for a pharmaceutical company. I was headed to meet a client in the next town over, but the weather reports didn't warn me about, well, all this." He gestured vaguely toward the window, though the thick curtains hid the chaos beyond. Clara nodded knowingly. "Weather forecasts never get it right for Pinecrest. This place has a mind of its own." They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, trading bits and pieces of their lives. Clara told him about growing up in the city, moving to Pinecrest 20 years ago and opening her bakery shortly after. She spoke fondly of the community, the regular customers who became friends, and the joy of creating something beautiful with her own hands. Daniel listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions or comments. In return, he shared snippets of his life, his demanding job that kept him constantly on the road, the loneliness that came with living out of hotels, and the pressure to always be somewhere new. There was a weariness in his voice, a longing for something more stable, something real. As the hours passed, the storm began to ease, the wind dying down to a gentle whisper. By dawn, the world outside was eerily still, blanketed in pristine white. Clara glanced out the window and sighed. "Looks like the worst is over. You should probably think about heading out soon before the roads freeze again." Daniel frowned, reluctant to leave the warmth and comfort of the bakery and Clara's company. "Are you sure? I mean, I feel like I owe you more than just a quick goodbye." Clara smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You don't owe me anything. Just promise me you'll take better care of yourself next time. These roads aren't forgiving." He nodded slowly, knowing she was right. After finishing his tea, he stood carefully, testing his balance. His legs felt wobbly, but he managed to stay upright with Clara's help. She handed him his coat, now dry and warm from being draped near the heater, and walked him to the door. Before stepping outside, Daniel turned to face her one last time. "I mean it, Clara. Thank you for everything. If there's ever anything I can do to repay you, please let me know." She gave him a reassuring smile, though part of her doubted they'd ever cross paths again. "Just pay it forward," she said simply. "That's all the thanks I need." With that, Daniel stepped out into the crisp morning air, leaving Clara standing in the doorway watching until his figure disappeared into the distance. As she closed the door and locked it behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter had left an impression, not just on him, but on her too. For the rest of the day, Clara found herself replaying their conversation in her mind. Something about Daniel's gratitude had touched her deeply. It wasn't often she met someone who truly appreciated the simple act of kindness. And yet, as the hours ticked by and life returned to normal, she pushed those thoughts aside, convincing herself it was just another ordinary day in an otherwise unremarkable winter. Little did she know, that knock on her door 4 days later would prove just how extraordinary that snowy night had truly been. The next few days passed in a blur of routine for Clara. Life in Pinecrest had a way of settling back into its predictable rhythm, no matter how unusual the events that disrupted it. The bakery reopened as usual, filling the air with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and sweet pastries. Customers came and went, chatting casually about the storm, the car accident they'd heard about, and the mysterious man who'd been rescued. But Clara didn't talk much about what happened that night. When asked, she brushed it off with a simple, just doing what anyone would have done. She wasn't looking for praise or attention. In fact, the thought of being the center of gossip made her uneasy. Still, there was something about Daniel's gratitude that lingered in her mind. His words, sincere, heartfelt, had struck a chord deep within her. It wasn't often she met someone who truly understood the value of kindness, especially from a stranger. Despite her efforts to focus on work, Clara found herself replaying their brief encounter over and over again. There was something about the way he looked at her, as if she'd done something extraordinary, when all she'd done was follow her instincts. Maybe it was because acts of kindness like that didn't happen often enough in Pinecrest. Or maybe it was because Daniel himself seemed different from most people who passed through town. He wasn't just polite, he was genuine. And that was rare. Meanwhile, miles away in Chicago, Daniel struggled to shake off the memory of Clara and that snowy night. Physically, he was sore but recovering. His ribs were bruised, not broken, and his head wound had scabbed over without needing stitches. But emotionally, he felt unsettled. The image of Clara standing in her bakery doorway, calm and composed despite the chaos outside, haunted him. How could someone so selfless exist in a world that often felt cold and indifferent? Daniel tried to distract himself with work, diving into spreadsheets, emails, and meetings. But every time he sat down to focus, his thoughts drifted back to Pinecrest. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had risked her own safety to save his life. What kind of person did that? Not out of obligation, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. One evening, after another long day at the office, Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the window of his high-rise apartment. The city lights twinkled below, but they offered none of the warmth he'd felt in Clara's bakery. That tiny, unassuming place had given him more comfort than anything else in recent memory. And Clara, she had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten: humanity. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, searching for someone, anyone, who might know how to properly thank her. But who could he call? A florist? Too impersonal? A gift card? Too generic. Nothing seemed adequate. Finally, an idea began to form in his mind. It was bold, maybe even a little reckless, but it felt right. The next morning, Daniel called his lawyer. "I need your help with something," he said, cutting straight to the point. There's a woman in Pinecrest who saved my life last week. I want to give her $50,000. The lawyer paused, clearly taken aback. 50,000? Are you sure about this? Yes, Daniel replied firmly. She didn't ask for anything, but I can't just walk away from what she did for me. This is the least I can do. After some discussion, they agreed on the details. The money would be transferred directly to Clara's account anonymously, accompanied by a letter explaining why it was being sent. Daniel hoped it would be enough to show her how much her actions meant to him, how much she meant to him. Back in Pinecrest, Clara remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in Daniel's mind. Her days followed their usual pattern: baking, before sunrise, serving customers during the day, and retreating to her cozy apartment upstairs once the bakery closed. Yet, beneath the surface, subtle changes were beginning to ripple through the town. Word of her heroic act spread quickly, thanks to a handful of curious locals who'd witnessed the aftermath of the crash. Some praised her bravery, calling her a hero. Others whispered behind closed doors, questioning her motives. Why had she gone out in such dangerous weather? Was she expecting something in return? These questions gnawed at the edges of Pinecrest's otherwise peaceful atmosphere. At first, Clara ignored the murmurs. She'd lived in Pinecrest long enough to know how quickly rumors could spiral out of control. Besides, she had more important things to worry about, like perfecting her recipe for apple cinnamon rolls or figuring out why her oven temperature seemed slightly off lately. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder. One afternoon, while arranging loaves of bread, in the display case, Clara overheard two women talking near the counter. "Did you hear about Clara and that man she saved?" one of them said, her tone dripping with suspicion. "Rumor has it he gave her a big reward." Clara froze, her hands hovering mid-air. She forced herself to turn around slowly, pretending not to have heard. "Can I help you ladies with anything?" she asked brightly, masking her discomfort with a smile. The women exchanged glances but said nothing, opting instead to pay for their purchases and leave. Clara watched them go, her chest tightening. So, the rumors had started. She should have expected it. The small-town grapevine was notorious for twisting facts until they barely resembled the truth. Still, hearing those words hit close to home stung more than she cared to admit. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment sipping chamomile tea, Clara allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened. She thought about Daniel, wondering if he'd made it safely to his destination. She wondered if he ever thought about her, too. Most of all, she wondered why people couldn't simply accept that sometimes good deeds were done without strings attached. As she drifted off to sleep, Clara told herself it didn't matter what others thought. She knew her own heart, and that was all that mattered. But deep down, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout. Would Pinecrest ever see her the same way again? Little did she know, the answer to that question would arrive sooner than expected, in the form of a knock at her door that would change everything. It was late in the afternoon, 4 days after the storm, when the knock came. Clara had just finished closing up the bakery for the day. She'd spent hours kneading dough, decorating cakes, and chatting with customers, but her mind kept drifting back to the whispers she'd overheard earlier. The rumors about her and the man she'd saved were growing louder, spreading like wildfire through Pinecrest. Some people smiled at her warmly, thanking her for what she'd done. Others avoided eye contact, their expressions unreadable. It left Clara feeling uneasy, as though she were walking on thin ice. She locked the front door and flipped the open sign to closed, letting out a sigh of relief as the quiet settled around her. The bakery always felt different once the customers were gone. Calmer, more intimate. She loved this time of day, when the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the counter. But today, something felt off. Maybe it was the weight of the gossip pressing down on her, or maybe it was just the lingering chill from the storm that refused to leave. As she wiped down the counters, there was a sharp rap at the door. Clara turned, surprised. No one usually came by this late. Peering through the glass, she saw 3 men standing on her porch dressed in dark suits. Their polished shoes looked out of place against the slushy snow melting on her welcome mat. One of them held an envelope in his hand. Clara hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. Who were these men? What did they want? For a moment she considered ignoring the knock altogether, but curiosity got the better of her. She dried her hands on her apron, unlocked the door, and cracked it open just enough to see them clearly. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously, her voice steady despite the unease bubbling inside her. The tallest of the three stepped forward, offering a polite smile. "Ms. Clara Thompson?" he asked, glancing briefly at the envelope in his hand. "That's me," she replied, gripping the edge of the door tightly. "What is this about?" "We're here on behalf of someone who wishes to express his gratitude," the man said smoothly, holding out the envelope. "May we come in?" Clara frowned, instinctively stepping back. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. These men weren't from Pinecrest. That much was obvious. They carried themselves with a certain formality, the kind she associated with lawyers or bankers. And that envelope, it looked official, almost intimidating. "I'm sorry," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I don't know who sent you, but I don't think it's regarding the incident last week," the man interrupted gently, his tone calm but insistent. "The car accident, surely you remember." Clara's stomach tightened. Of course she remembered. How could she forget? But why were these strangers showing up now, days later? Her mind raced, trying to piece together what might be happening. Was this some kind of trick? A scam? Or worse, retaliation for saving that man's life? "I don't need anything," she said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. "I didn't do what I did for recognition or reward. If whoever sent you wants to thank me, tell them they already have." The man nodded, seemingly unfazed by her defensiveness. "We understand your hesitation, Ms. Thompson. Please believe us when we say our client means no harm. In fact, quite the opposite. He simply wants to ensure you're properly compensated for your actions." "Compensated?" Clara repeated, her brow furrowing. "For what? Pulling someone out of a car? That's not something you get paid for." The second man spoke up then, his voice softer, almost apologetic. "Our client disagrees. He believes your actions saved his life, and possibly more. This is merely a gesture of appreciation." Clara crossed her arms, feeling a mix of confusion and irritation. "Look, I appreciate the thought, but I don't want any money. I didn't do it for that. Now, if you'll excuse me." Before she could close the door, the first man stepped closer, his expression serious. "Ms. Thompson, please hear us out. Our client has already taken steps to ensure you receive this gift. The funds have been transferred to your account." Her jaw dropped. "What? Transferred? You can't just—" "It's done," he said firmly, cutting her off. "There's nothing you can do to reverse it. All we ask is that you accept it graciously." Clara stared at him, stunned. Accept it? Graciously? How could she accept something she hadn't asked for? Money wasn't supposed to be part of this. She'd acted out of instinct, out of humanity, not because she expected anything in return. "I don't want it," she said finally, her voice trembling with frustration. "Take it back. Give it to charity. Or give it to whoever needs it most. Just don't involve me." The men exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such resistance. After a brief pause, the first man sighed. "We'll relay your wishes to our client, but I must warn you, it may not change anything. He's quite determined." With that, they turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing in the doorway, her mind spinning. She closed the door slowly, leaning against it as reality sank in. $50,000. That's what the envelope had said. $50,000 deposited into her account without her consent. She sank onto the nearest chair, her legs suddenly weak beneath her. What was she supposed to do with that kind of money? Sure, she could use it to expand the bakery, hire extra help, or even take a vacation for the first time in years. But none of those things felt right. This wasn't hers to keep. It was tainted, complicated, and completely unnecessary. As the minutes ticked by, Clara realized the implications went beyond just her own discomfort. Pinecrest was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. News of this gift would spread faster than wildfire, fueling the rumors that were already swirling. People would assume the worst, that she'd manipulated the situation, that she'd planned this all along. Her chest tightened at the thought. She'd lived in Pinecrest for 2 decades, building a life, earning trust, creating a space where people felt welcome. And now, in the span of a single week, everything felt fragile, as if the foundation she'd worked so hard to build was crumbling beneath her feet. Clara sat there long after the sun had set, staring at the envelope on the table. Inside was a letter explaining the transfer, signed by a name she recognized immediately: Daniel Harper. So, it was him. The man she'd pulled from the wreckage, the one whose gratitude had seemed so genuine. Why would he do this? Didn't he realize how much trouble it could cause? She clenched her fists, torn between anger and guilt. Anger at Daniel for forcing this on her, and guilt for even considering rejecting it. Part of her understood why he'd done it. He wanted to repay her, to show his appreciation in a tangible way. But good intentions didn't erase the consequences, not in a place like Pinecrest. By the time she finally stood up, exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. There was no easy solution, no clear path forward. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and likely more questions than answers. The next morning, Clara woke up with a heaviness in her chest that no amount of coffee could shake. She stared at the envelope on her kitchen table, its edges crisp and untouched. It felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode into chaos, the moment she stepped outside. The money, Daniel's gift, was already in her account, according to the letter. There was nothing she could do about it now, but that didn't make her feel any better. Pinecrest wasn't the kind of town where secrets stayed hidden for long. She dressed quickly, tying her apron around her waist as she made her way downstairs to open the bakery. As soon as she unlocked the door, the first customer walked in, a regular who always stopped by for a bagel and cream cheese before work. He greeted her warmly, just like he did every day, but something about his smile seemed forced. "Morning, Clara," he said, glancing toward the counter. "Heard you've been busy lately." Clara froze mid-step, her hands gripping the cash register. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know." He waved a hand vaguely, clearly uncomfortable. "All that talk about what happened during the storm. People are saying some interesting things." Her stomach sank. So it had started already. "Like what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light, though her pulse quickened. "Well?" He hesitated, shifting awkwardly. "Some folks think maybe there's more to the story than meets the eye. You know how people can be." Clara forced a tight smile, nodding as if she understood, even though her mind was racing. More to the story? What exactly were they implying? That she'd planned the whole thing? That she'd somehow orchestrated the accident just to get noticed, or worse, paid? The man shuffled away after paying for his bagel, leaving Clara standing behind the counter, her face flushed with frustration. She knew this was coming. Pinecrest thrived on gossip, and the idea of someone receiving $50,000 out of nowhere was practically begging for speculation. Still, hearing it firsthand stung more than she expected. As the day wore on, the whispers grew louder. Customers lingered longer than usual, pretending to browse while exchanging sideways glances. Some avoided her entirely, their eyes darting away whenever she tried to meet them. Others weren't so subtle. One woman leaned against the counter, tapping her nails absent-mindedly as she spoke. "So I heard you got quite the reward for saving that man," she said casually, her tone laced with insinuation. Clara clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. "It wasn't like that," she replied evenly. "I didn't ask for anything. I don't even want it." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Still, must be nice to have that kind of money fall into your lap. Makes you wonder why anyone else bothers working hard, doesn't it?" Clara bit back a sharp retort, reminding herself that arguing wouldn't help. Instead, she focused on serving the next customer, though her hands trembled slightly as she handed over change. By noon, the tension in the air was palpable. Even the regulars who usually joked with her seemed distant, their laughter quieter, their smiles thinner. That evening, as Clara closed up shop, she noticed a group of teenagers loitering near the front window. They pointed and laughed, their voices carrying through the glass. She couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but the malice in their tone was unmistakable. Forcing herself to ignore them, she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, locking the door firmly behind her. But the trouble didn't end there. Later that night, as she sat reading by the fire, a loud crash shattered the silence. Startled, she jumped to her feet and rushed to the window. Her heart sank when she saw the scene below. The bakery's front window had been smashed, shards of glass glittering ominously under the streetlights. A rock lay in the middle of the floor, surrounded by scattered pastries and broken display stands. Tied to the rock was a piece of paper. Clara grabbed her coat and hurried downstairs, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped carefully through the debris. She picked up the rock and unfolded the note attached to it. In jagged letters it read, "You don't belong here." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away furiously. This wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about fear, jealousy, and the ugly side of human nature rearing its head. Pinecrest had always been her home, a place where she thought she belonged. Now it felt foreign, hostile even. She spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess, sweeping up glass and salvaging what she could from the ruined goods. Every movement felt mechanical, her body going through the motions while her mind replayed the events of the past few days. Who would do this? Who hated her enough to destroy her livelihood? Or was it just random vandalism, fueled by the rumors, spreading like poison through the town? By sunrise, exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. She called the local police to report the damage, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't change much. The officers promised to investigate, but their expressions told her they weren't optimistic. Small towns like Pinecrest often swept things under the rug rather than confront the truth. As the day dragged on, Clara found herself questioning everything. Should she leave? Start over somewhere new? But the thought of abandoning her bakery, the dream she'd poured her heart and soul into, felt unbearable. This place was more than just a business. It was part of her identity. Yet staying meant facing the hostility head-on, enduring the stares, the whispers, the accusations. It was a lose-lose situation, and she didn't know how to fix it. Just as despair began to creep in, another knock sounded at the door. Clara froze, her heart pounding. Not again, she thought. Hadn't she dealt with enough visitors for 1 week? Steeling herself, she opened the door cautiously and nearly gasped. When she saw who stood on the other side, it was Daniel. Clara blinked, her hand still gripping the edge of the door. For a moment she thought she might be imagining things. Daniel standing there on her porch, looking as though he'd stepped straight out of the storm that had brought them together just days ago. His suit was replaced by a casual jacket and jeans, but his expression was unmistakably earnest, tinged with worry. "Hi," he said softly, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Can I come in?" Clara hesitated. Part of her wanted to slam the doctor shut and retreat back into the safety of her world, or what little remained of it. But another part, the part that remembered how grateful he'd been when she saved him, couldn't turn him away. She stepped aside silently, letting him enter. The bakery smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt sugar, remnants of yesterday's baking. Daniel glanced around, taking in the cozy space before settling his eyes on Clara. "I heard about what happened," he began, his voice heavy with guilt. "About the window and everything else." Clara crossed her arms tightly, her defenses rising. "You mean the money?" she asked sharply. "That's why all this started. People think I planned it, like I tricked you or something." Daniel winced, clearly understanding the weight of his actions for the first time. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said quickly. I wanted to thank you, to show you how much your kindness meant to me." "Well, congratulations," Clara shot back, her voice trembling with frustration. "You've turned my life upside down. My neighbors hate me, my business is falling apart, and someone threw a rock through my window last night. Is that what you wanted?" Her words hung in the air between them, sharp and unyielding. Daniel looked stricken, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her anger. "No, of course not," he murmured. I didn't realize it would cause so much trouble." "That's the problem," Clara snapped. "You didn't think. You just acted without considering how it would affect me or anyone else." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat, his voice quieter but firmer. "I'm sorry, truly. I came here because I need to fix this. Not just apologize, but actually make things right." Clara stared at him, searching his face for sincerity. There was no arrogance in his expression, no defensiveness, just genuine remorse. Slowly, her posture relaxed, though her guard remained up. "And how exactly do you plan to fix this?" she asked skeptically. Daniel exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "First, we need to address the rumors. People are assuming the worst because they don't know the truth. If you're willing, I'll tell them myself. Explain that the money wasn't your idea, that it was my decision alone." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You really think that'll help? Most people around here won't care who decided what. They'll still see me as someone who got something for nothing." "I know," Daniel admitted, "which is why we need to go further than just explaining. We need to show them who you really are. The person who risked her life to save a stranger, who runs this bakery with heart and soul, who gives back to the community every single day." He paused, glancing around the room again. "What if we hosted an event here? Something big enough to bring everyone together to remind them why they love this place, and why they should support you?" Clara frowned, unsure. "An event? Like what?" "A celebration," Daniel said, his tone brightening slightly. "We could call it the Snowstorm Gala, honoring the night you saved my life. Invite the whole town, serve free food, play music, maybe even auction off some baked goods for charity. It'll give people a chance to see you for who you are instead of listening to gossip." Clara considered the idea, her mind racing. On one hand, it sounded risky, opening herself up to judgment after everything that had happened. But on the other hand, it felt like the only way forward. She couldn't let fear dictate her life, couldn't let bitterness take root where kindness used to grow. "Okay," she said finally, surprising even herself. "Let's do it." Daniel smiled, relief washing over his features. "Thank you. I promise I'll handle everything, from organizing to funding. All you have to do is be yourself." Over the next few hours, they sat together at one of the bakery tables, sketching out plans for the gala. Clara suggested ideas for decorations and menu items, while Daniel jotted notes furiously, already envisioning the logistics. Despite the tension lingering between them, there was a sense of camaraderie, a shared determination to reclaim what had been lost. As evening fell, Daniel packed up his things, promising to return the next day to start setting up. Before leaving, he turned back to Clara, his expression serious. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said quietly. "But I swear, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Clara nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in days. "Just don't make promises you can't keep," she replied, her tone lighter than before. "Pinecrest doesn't forgive easily." Daniel chuckled softly, though his eyes remained steady. "Neither do I. That's why I'm sticking around until we fix this, together." With that, he stepped out into the cold night, leaving Clara standing in the doorway once again. This time, however, she didn't feel quite so alone.